Very pleased you've joined us. Washington County Kids' big mission is to promote and increase access to quality out-of-school time programs for all youth, from North Plains to Sherwood and Beaverton to Banks. We believe after-school and summer programs help all youth achieve their full potential, and we support this in quite a few ways. One is by helping parents and providers through events such as tonight, with information on topics relevant to all families. Tonight's event will also feature Spanish translation by Luis Aguilera. And Luis, now would be a good time for you to share information needed for anybody needing translation.
Hola, buenas noches. Queremos informarle que tenemos disponible interpretación en español. En la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla, usted va a ver un icono que es como un globo terráqueo. Haga clic ahí y seleccione la opción español para tener acceso a la interpretación simultánea de este evento. Gracias.
Awesome. Thank you. We're glad you're here. Also with us from Washington County Kids tonight is Katie Riley, President. Katie, do you want to wave? There we go. And Jessica Sim, Program Coordinator. And these two have put the pieces together to make this all happen, and will be also helping facilitate questions during tonight's program. In addition, there is a door prize at the end of the program, so please stay all the way. Make sure that your name is actually listed on the screen. That would be great. Makes it a little bit easier for Jessica. And at the end, we'll be doing a raffle, which will feature children's books that have been collected by the Retired Teachers Association. Also, we'll provide an evaluation link at the end of the presentation, and really appreciate your participation. It helps us provide the best events possible. And lastly, I want to encourage you all to ask questions in the Q&A or the chat feature. And consider joining on video, if you will. It helps to facilitate a more personal interaction, but of course, that's up to each attendee. And now I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, Carissa Mazurskowitz. Hopefully I got that. Who's Assistant Professor in the School of Learning and Teaching at Pacific University. Carissa, thank you for being here tonight. I'm gonna turn this over to you, and hopefully I didn't mangle your name too badly.
No, you did a great job. Thank you, Larry. Well, it's an honor to be here with you all this evening. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second so I can see people on the screen. Oh, I guess I can't because it's a panel. That's right. Okay, so I will share again. Sorry. I thought I would be able to see participants, but please share questions as we go along, because I can't quite see if folks are raising their hands or not, since I don't see you on screen here. But again, it's an honor to be here. As Larry said, I'm in the School of Learning and Teaching at Pacific University. I've been in education for over 20 years and got my start on a tiny island named Saipan, which is near Guam in the South Pacific. My background is in special education, and that's where I started teaching, and then went on to work in Hawaii and get my master's degree there, and came here to Oregon to raise a family, and did my PhD actually at Pacific. And my research is around mindfulness, well-being, contemplative practices, mental health, and trauma-informed teaching practices. So I've worked with students with trauma for many years, who have experienced trauma for many years. And so this is an area that's very near and dear to my heart. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Okay, so we can start off by kind of, usually I would do this in a teacher format and I would ask you all what you think of as trauma, but I will just kind of present the information here. And like I said, please let me know if you have questions as we go along. So trauma is it's very complex. It affects way more folks than we think. If there's maybe 20 of us here this evening, we should assume that at least 12 or 14 of us have been impacted by one or more adverse childhood experiences, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So one definition would be an individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual. So experience is the key, as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So it's something that impacts us and affects all these different areas of our lives. And again, this kind of key here is that is experienced, and that's what we'll talk more about as we go forward. But each individual experiences things different. So what may be a traumatic event for some person, for someone may not be as experienced as a traumatic event for someone else. As we talk about ACEs, most of those are experienced in different ways, but are all traumatic events for folks. So I think the first lesson to just be aware of is that trauma transforms lives. And I love this illustration because I think it really shows how things can just be blown to pieces by what your experience of trauma is. So from my own experience, I lost my dad to cancer when I was 13, and I experienced that as trauma. As we talk about adverse childhood experiences and the ACEs research that was done, they didn't include death of a parent in those research studies, but in other studies and other lenses of trauma, the death of a parent can be considered a traumatic experience. And for me, the way that I experienced it, it definitely was. It blew my life into a million different pieces. And I struggled with mental health issues for about 5 to 6 years after that. And then my healing came about. I also am a survivor of sexual assault, and that happened when I was 17. So one of the ACEs questions is related to that. So I would have an ACE score of 1 because of that experience. So the good news is that although trauma transforms lives and can destroy pieces of ourselves and the way that we understand the world, healing is possible. I am a living testament to this from my own experience. And I have seen it time and time again with the students and the folks that I have worked with in my years in education. So healing from trauma is possible. So that's the one thing I hope you folks will take from this evening, because I think that's really important to remember. So I think another important factor is to understand that you can't look at a person and know that they have experienced trauma. Typically, there are signs, and I will tell everyone that's willing to listen that behavior is communication. So when you see a child or even an adult acting in a way that doesn't seem warranted for the situation, or they're very dysregulated, they're having emotional instability and things like that, this is communicating to us that something is wrong. So this is actually a picture of the island of Saipan back here where I first started teaching. It's 8 miles by 11. It's a tiny little island in the middle of the South Pacific. And this little islet here is called Managaha. And I love this image because there's everything that's happening in this part of the reef is under the surface. I'm a scuba diver and a free diver, and it's something I love doing. So you look here and it just looks like, okay, there's some beautiful blue water, but all the world is underneath this reef. There's turtles and sharks and rays and a million different kinds of fish and coral and all these different wonderful creatures. And they're all below the surface. So when we look at children and we see them, we don't really know what's happening, and we have to dig a little bit deeper. So that's an important thing to understand with children. So just looking at them, we often don't know that they've been impacted by trauma, but behavior will often tell us as another form of communication that something has happened to this child. So the really important thing, so being trauma informed and being aware, the crux of all of that, of what do we do about it, is safety, right? So trauma makes folks feel unsafe, right? Whether it's that they witnessed a school shooting or they had been abused by a parent or a sibling. All of that takes away the element of safety. So when we're trying to create an environment for folks to open up, to communicate, and to heal, this is the priority. And I use this image because I used to live on the Big Island of Hawaii, in which there is an active volcano. There was an active volcano in my backyard. So the idea that safety is paramount, I think, is really important, because that is the only way that we can help individuals to heal. So this image is safety first. Another lesson here is that trauma is everywhere. So as I started kind of sharing that when I when I taught on the island of Saipan, I first learned that my students were really impacted by disability in general, which is what my area was for teaching. So disability and then multicultural influences of colonization in the various islands of the South Pacific. And oftentimes, well, actually all of my students were English language learners, and many of them had been impacted by trauma. And that was a very big realization for me as a new teacher, to understand that my children were really, they were coming to school with way more than what I had expected, right? They were not coming to school ready to read and write, or to learn how to read and write. They were coming to school to be nurtured and to have a safe environment. And I share this picture because this is of Oregon. And although that was my experience, that I would say 9 out of 10 of the students that I worked with had experienced trauma. That was the same in Hawaii. I worked on the Big Island in a Title I school, so there was a lot of poverty involved there as well. And then I moved to Oregon, and I didn't expect to see this in the Beaverton School District where I was teaching. And when I got to Oregon, I realized trauma is everywhere. And the kids that I was working with in Beaverton were just as impacted by trauma as the ones that I had worked with in various parts of the world. So that's another thing. I wish that if I could have a dream here, it would be that people look at a group of people and assume that most of them have been impacted by trauma, because that's what the statistics will show us here in just a minute. So trauma is everywhere. So coming from some tiny little places, I came to Oregon and realized it is no different. I think another really important thing to understand about trauma is that it's not singular. So how we experience it, as I said before, is very different. Everybody experiences these things differently. So those who experience trauma, their experience is not identical. The contexts and cultures within which each of us lives are as varied as the blades of grass in a field. So to know that trauma is experienced in a myriad of ways, very differently by people, depending on their culture, their context, and the experience of trauma that they experience. So as I shared in the very beginning, I lost my dad when I was young. I also have a girlfriend who lost her father just a couple years after mine, and she did not experience it as trauma. It was grief, it was loss, it was a horrific experience for her family. But the way that her faith and tradition and their religion and their family handled it was very different than how mine handled it. So that's an experience of trauma that for me, that losing my father resulted in a traumatic experience for me, whereas it did not for someone else, for a close friend of mine who also lost her parent around the same time. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So what are ACEs? So some of you may be aware of the adverse childhood experiences and the research behind this. So as we talked about, there are more forms of trauma, but for the research to be conducted, this is these are the studies that have been replicated over time and continue to produce most of our research and understanding about ACEs. And so the different types of ACEs that they looked at for the research, and this is what we'll talk about in the next few slides, are these 3 different categories, right? So abuse being physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse. Neglect being physical neglect or emotional neglect. And then household dysfunction is the 3rd category. So mental illness in the home, incarcerated mother, father, relative, abuse toward a parent, substance abuse, and divorce. So that's the household piece, and then the neglect piece, and then the abuse piece. So these are the 10 different areas that have been studied over the last couple, I think 20 years. And there's been really dramatic results, and they've been replicated over time within different populations. So the research is very strong in these areas. And I have shared various resources with you folks. And so you don't really, I mean, if you have experienced these ACEs, you probably know that. So you can kind of identify your score. There is a quiz you could take if you were interested in doing so, but some folks have an ACEs score of 1 out of 10, all the way to 10 out of 10. So a lot of, and what they've found is that the higher your ACEs scores, the more correlated that is with physical health symptoms as well. So that's part of the research behind the Kaiser study here. So kind of knowing your ACEs score is a way to talk about it and to understand that you're not alone and that folks, many folks have experienced that. So we'll see just how prevalent it is. So how common are ACEs? They've basically found that about 36% of the population has 0. And so then the converse of that, right, would be that about 64% of the population has experienced 1 or more ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. So that to me is a shocking number. 64%, that's why I say, you know, I look at it like 7 out of 10 in a group of people. That's the majority of the people in a group. So I think that's a way for us to shift our thinking about how prevalent trauma is in our communities. And it is not more prevalent in BIPOC communities or lower income communities. It is across all socioeconomic, all races, cultures. It's non-discriminant. So about 26% of the population has 1 ACE, and about 16% have 2. About 9.5% have 3, and about 12.5% have 4 or more. And so just to go back to the categories, right? So we're talking about very dramatic, traumatic experiences as a child, right? So before your 18th birthday, did you experience, the quiz would ask you, did you experience physical, emotional, or sexual abuse? Did you experience physical or emotional neglect? Or did you live in a home with someone who had mental illness, was incarcerated, dealt with substance abuse, or experienced divorce? Or did you witness abuse? It's very common to witness abuse towards a mother, and that's a very traumatic experience for children. So back to our percentage here, right? 64% of our population. And like I said, it's replicable across all categories. I like this image because I think it takes into account a little bit bigger picture than the last few graphics, and kind of looking at the different, I gotta move my people here just so I can see what I'm saying. Okay, so I had to move my icon over, sorry, so I can see this. So this first one, the tree, right, this household, physical and emotional neglect, domestic violence, maternal depression. So a mother with depression it dramatically affects children. Bullying, an incarcerated family member, divorce, homelessness or houselessness, parental mental illness or alcoholism and drug abuse, and then emotional and sexual abuse. So all of these things can happen in the household, right? But then there's these other things that are within the community, right, that also are connected to these ACEs. So within the community, right, whether it's poverty, substandard wages, poor housing quality and affordability, food scarcity, lack of jobs, structural racism, poor water and air quality, lack of social capital and mobility, violence, historical trauma, substandard schools, discrimination, all of these factors play a role, right, in these different areas. And then here in Oregon, it's not shocking to talk about environmental traumas and things like the climate crisis, right? So record heat and droughts, which we've had record heat recently. We can look at the pictures of the wildfires of 2020 to see the red skies that were over Salem and many of the areas around here. The record storms, flooding, mudslides, sea levels rising, tornado, and then natural disasters, right? We had a large influx of people that moved up here after Hurricane Katrina many years ago. Volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes, and my favorite, pandemic, right? We can't ignore that. So I use this slide probably 5 years ago. And then I realized, oh, here it becomes oh so relevant after 2020, and we've all gone through COVID. But there are different schools of thought as talking about did COVID create global trauma for everyone involved? Trauma experts would say no. Actually, the pandemic created collective grief, right? We all experienced grief and loss because of the pandemic, but the pandemic didn't create trauma for everyone. It may have created trauma for certain families. It may have created conditions where traumatic experiences would be more exacerbated and more prevalent. But most trauma specialists would not say that the pandemic itself was a traumatic experience for everyone, because it's how you experience it, right? So back to that idea of trauma is how you experience what is happening to you, right? So move to the next slide here. And so what do we do, right? When we realize that there's trauma everywhere around us, and the majority of folks in our lives, whether it's in our professional spaces, our friends and family, our communities, but the majority of folks have experienced trauma in their lifetime. And if I had my druthers, we would take that as probably the greatest task that needs to be addressed in our lifetimes. But the question that we do use is a reframing of what's wrong with you, right? And as I said before, behavior is communication. So oftentimes we see kids that are having meltdowns, or they're becoming violent or aggressive, or they're breaking things, or they're really struggling with relationship skills, or they're super withdrawn and isolated, right? So the reframing of the question, what's wrong with you? A trauma-informed perspective asks a different question, and that question is, what happened to you? And I just recently was made aware, as I was looking for materials for this presentation, that I believe Oprah Winfrey wrote a book, and it's called What Happened to You? And it's as she learned more and more about trauma and trauma-informed practices, she co-authored this book. I can't remember the name of the medical professional that she wrote it with. But Oprah Winfrey has an ACEs score of 6, I believe. She was sexually abused as a child. She had a baby at 11 as a result of that abuse, and the child died. So this is a woman who has experienced more ACEs than a lot of folks, and has gone on to use it as a platform for her for healing and for understanding other folks. So she has a new book called What Happened to You? And I think that's a really important question to keep in our minds, right? And if we think about this, whether this is the person at the at Starbucks in front of you who's being super rude and yelling at the barista, right? Rather than what's wrong with you, which is our typical reaction that many of us would be like, what is going on with this person, right? Oftentimes that question is, what happened to you, right? There's a story behind that. So just a little bit of background information. We talk about 3 different types of trauma: acute, chronic, and crossover. And I'll just go through those quickly. But I think what's more important is not knowing the type by any means, but more the characteristics and kind of the examples, right? So kind of acute trauma, which is like a type 1 trauma, results from exposure to a single overwhelming event, right? And so that's what I experienced as the death of my father. But it's also rape, or like I said, death of a loved one, or a natural disaster, right? So that would be one acute adverse experience that happened, a single overwhelming event. And what can happen to folks because of this could be detailed memories, right? Where they're kind of reliving that trauma, reliving that experience, kind of these omens and premonitions for the future that something bad is going to happen. Hypervigilance, right? They're very concerned about safety. That's the key. Maybe an exaggerated startle response where they're more startled than would be kind of typical for the situation. And oftentimes misperceptions and overreactions can happen as a result of that too, right? So that's one form. That's kind of that exposure to the one event. And then there's the extended exposure to traumatizing situations, which is what we call complex trauma, or type 2. And this would be prolonged exposure to violence or bullying, profound neglect, or a series of home removals. So working with kids that have been homeless or have been in the foster care system for a really long time. You can see some of these experiences or some of these characteristics with those kids. They've been removed from their home time and time again because of what's happening with their families, or prolonged exposure to violence or bullying or abuse, right? So I have heard far more stories from my students than I ever wanted to hear about how common this is. And how many of them have lived with it for so long. And sometimes they'll say, this is the first time I've told anyone ever about this. And so I have lots of resources for folks to go and help in their healing journey. So some of the characteristics would be this kind of denial of the situation. And that's why sometimes folks don't talk about these situations until they're in their 20s. And I find them in higher education, and they are students in my classes. And somehow we start talking about trauma, and they suddenly remember, oh gosh, this is actually what happened to me as a child. There's oftentimes a lot of psychological numbing, which is just kind of not being present and just kind of numb to the whole world. And that's just a way of protecting oneself as they go through. Disassociation, right? So kind of separating from the problem. Sometimes rage, we see this with kids, where they have a tendency to throw things and break things because it's the only way that they can release that frustration, that anger, that hurt, that pain. Social withdrawal, right? So sometimes we have the kids that we call them the chair chuckers, right? The ones that are throwing things. And then we have the kids that don't say anything. And those are actually the ones that concern me the most, who are really socially withdrawn, isolated, and very quiet, and often don't come to classes, or you don't get to interact with them as much. Those are the ones that are much harder to connect with. The rage is very obvious. There's something going on. Like I said, communication, right? Behavior is communication. There's often sometimes a sense of this foreshortened future that the world is not it's not what we thought it was, and my time here is not very long. I will say, with this kind of extended exposure to traumatizing situations, in particular, this idea of rage and anger, and frustration, and communicating through behaviors. One of the schools on the coast, a principal went in, she was a new principal, and she went in and realized that there were so many instances of kids throwing things, breaking things, these really, really violent outbursts, that in order to transform the school, she said, okay, we're going to create a room where we're going to make sure that it's safe, and the kids can go in there and they can break things if they need to. And that was her first step into trauma-informed practice. This was done with professionals, of course. But the first step for that year was to have a room where if kids needed to release that anger, they actually had a space to do it. And she talks about this story of how it transformed over time to, it didn't need to be a room where things were broken. It just needed to be a room where people could take time and have space to decompress. And so that's just one example of how sometimes that's needed. I personally have a heavyweight bag out in my barn, and that is a very good place for me to safely discharge rage whenever it occurs. So I do encourage kids, teaching folks about their emotions and saying it's totally okay to feel the way that you're feeling. But punching a wall might break the wall, and it also might break your fist. So punching a pillow is a much better way to go about that. But just knowing that that's a real thing, and we have to figure out how to teach kids about their emotions and how to channel them and use them in a safe way, right? So the third type of trauma here is the crossover. And this is, again, a single traumatic event that is devastating enough to have long-lasting effects. So school shootings, car accidents involved, and a lot of our students are coming from war-torn countries, right? So refugee dislocation and things like that, and folks coming from a refugee situation. So characteristics of this could be perpetual mourning, long bouts of depression, sometimes chronic pain, concentration problems, sleep disturbances, and irritability. And sleep disturbances, I should say, can go with all of them. And that's something to think about too when kids are if children have experienced trauma, they typically have some kind of regression patterns where maybe, particularly if they're very young, they may lose some of those skills that they had already acquired. And sleep disturbances are very, very common when things happen. So that's just an example there. I have a good friend who teaches in the inner city in Chicago, and he frequently, very sadly, but frequently loses children in his class to shootings in the neighborhood. So it's typically 1, 2, 3 students a year that die in that school because of the gang violence in the area. And so it's something that the school is constantly in mourning and constantly trying to come back from these traumatic events. It's a very, very intense place to work. They're very lucky to have him because he's a very good soul, but it's a very difficult place to live and to work. And so this is kind of their chronic, their continuous trauma. Even though it's a single event, there's so many of them that it becomes really difficult to deal with. So what do we do? Again, there's so much. And so a few things that I think would be supportive for folks to know, whether this is, a child in your home or a family member or friend or someone in your community, or if you're a teacher or a care provider, how to help them, right? So like I said, safety is the most important thing for folks because trauma basically undermines their understanding of safety in all areas of their life. So having predictability is super important, right? So routines, structures, making sure that that folks know what's going to happen, right? They don't like to have surprises or change of plans, right? If there's going to be a change of plans, we need to talk about it first. We need to be as proactive about communicating that information as possible. So having routines and structures and really clear communication about what's going to happen is really the place to start with establishing a safe environment. So whether that's in your home or your classroom or your community. And I often have people say, well, but it seems like teenagers don't like routines and structures, right? And their whole thing is to kind of push back on that. But what's important is they may say that they don't really like it, but what we know about adolescents in particular is that they really do need those structures. Their job in adolescent development, right, as they're progressing, their job is to push up against those structures. That's their job, is to test the boundaries. But they have to feel that those boundaries are there, because when you're pushing against something and there's nothing there, you fall, and it feels very unsafe, and it totally undermines that concept of knowing what's going to happen and feeling safety and structure and routine. So having that predictability is key, and then having space where people can go where they feel safe, right? So whether that's giving a child a space in the home that's just theirs, or a space and even if it's just a small corner, or a place outside where they could go, a special, a tree or somewhere that they feel like is their place. We talk a lot about having calming corners, or areas in the classroom. So even if it's just a very small space, if a child needs to separate so that they can regulate themselves, that's really important that they have a way to disengage from whatever is happening. Another one that's really important, I would think one of the most important things is choice, right? So we really want to help people feel, because they feel powerless. Trauma makes you feel powerless. So providing choices empowers people, right? So even if it's, we talk about this in like love and logic and positive parenting, right? Even if it's, well, do you want to eat 3 bites of your vegetables or do you want to eat 2, right? Giving that choice is still something that you want to have happen, but 2 bites, that's fine if the kid chooses that versus 3 bites, but they feel empowered to do that. Or, do you want to wear this jacket or that jacket? Do you want to do this activity first or that activity first? Do you want to, this was always the one that I used with my kids when it came to toothbrushing, which for some reason young children never want to do. Do you want to brush your teeth now or in 2 minutes? They always wanted to do it in 2 minutes, but once you give them that choice, they then have the control and they feel empowered. So it's the little tiny things. And I would also say that they work with your spouses. They work with just about anybody in your life. So just providing choices to people is a good plan. And then this idea, here of practicing power with rather than power over. So oftentimes that real authoritative, overpowering doesn't work with kids who have experienced trauma. Because when you have nothing to lose, then somebody really doesn't have power over you. So to kind of understand that you're working alongside and you're working with to support rather than to kind of control. And then reciprocity, of course, giving people what you need, listening, empathy, compassion, right? And then just being kind and loving, calm and patient. That's probably one of the most important things, is that we are able to co-regulate the people in our lives, right? The people that we're interacting with, whether it's the children or coworkers or whoever you're with. When you're calm and regulated, it allows even dysregulated people to be more calm and regulated as well. So being calm and patient, and we're going to get into this in the next couple of slides, but then also having firm boundaries, right? Because those boundaries are really important with the predictability piece. So it kind of all ties together. Are there any questions at this point? We're about halfway through.
Don't see any questions posted yet, Carissa.
Okay. So this is just another image, right, about, and this is from the ECHO project, but kind of says all the same things, right? So predictability. Everyone loves to be surprises. Not true. Trauma survivors often prefer predictability because that feels safer, right? So back to the heart of everything being safety, right? Space. Allow time for the survivor to calm down and take perspective. Trauma survivors often have difficulty regulating emotions and take longer to calm down, right? So just having that space where they don't feel that you're they're not being overwhelmed by stimuli or by you, but giving them a moment and some time to calm down and to regulate their emotions and to maybe play a game or to listen to calming music or to look at a book, even if they're frustrated. And when they're really emotionally dysregulated, that might not happen right away. But sometimes that can be a really good tool for them. And you'll see them start to calm when they have a space to be safe in, right? Perspective. So being aware that when the past is intruding into the present, so don't take responsibility for what is not yours, right? So sometimes past things come into present conversations, or the trauma of the past is impacting the behavior that's happening now that doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the current situation. So just being mindful that trauma-informed lens has us take a different perspective, which is this is probably not related to what is happening now. And that can be, don't take things personally, right? It's not directed at you, but this might be connected to something in the past. Then there's this kind of recalibrating. So getting rid of this idea of this person is overreacting, right? Or they're oversensitive, or, this says get rid of over anything from your vocabulary, right? And then attribution, right? So don't refer to the person's upbringing problem, that they have issues or they have behavior, call it for what it is, and that's trauma. Then we talked about the reciprocity, right? Give what you need, listening, empathy, and empowerment, and supporting, being loving, patient, and kind, and empathetic. But you also have to protect yourself and setting your firm boundaries. And then the last one that we talked about too is choice. It can be a big trigger when a survivor is denied choice and control. So talk, confer, collaborate, and cooperate together is super important. I think I'll jump through this so that make sure we have enough time for questions at the end here. But there were just a couple more things that I wanted to touch on before we get to that. So this was basically just a summary. The child was having difficulties in school that were new behaviors, right? So started getting into fights and having problems with other kids. So the school typical response is they suspend the kid and it doesn't work. So they refer him to a psychologist who says, oh, well, let's do some investigating using a trauma-informed lens. And they find that the student is living with mom and the chronically abusive boyfriend, right? And then there's financial instability in the home, which are often intersecting factors. So what they did is collaborated between teachers and administrators and psychologists, and they gave him an alternative space to go within the school to calm down. They added a mentor to give some additional support, some weekly counseling also, and then taught the student about stress and trauma and recognizing those emotions and triggers, and learned some relaxation techniques. And then within 6 months, the child's behavior had decreased and was able to return to the level that it was prior to the adverse events. So again, what happened? What is happening to you? That question, instead of what's wrong with you, right? But, well, one of my first experiences with a child who was having kind of a real problem regulating their emotions because of the trauma in the home was when I was in Saipan. So again, a very new teacher, didn't really know what I was doing and had never experienced something like this before. And I had this young boy, he was, I think, 13. And I had a preparation period. So nobody was in my classroom. I was just in there doing prep work. And he came into my classroom and he's yelling and screaming, and I didn't even really understand what he was saying. He was just so dysregulated, and he threw off his backpack and he threw off his jacket and he kicked off his shoes and he took off his shirt and he threw himself in the corner and he just started crying hysterically. And I'm thinking, okay, you're safe, you're calm, it's okay. I knew that in the home, mom was being abused. I'm not sure. I think the children, there was some to the children as well. They were working with counselors and psychologists on the island, but there were a lot of cultural issues that were at play as well. So I was just trying to be calm myself and help this poor child who was in my corner, just a complete wreck. And so I called in the school psychologist, and she came in and she went over and I watched this, and it was amazing. And I have since used it myself. She did what I call an open water rescue, right? And this is literally what they do if you're out drowning in an open water situation. She went over to him and she said, "Hey, Isaiah, my name is Susan, and I'm here to help. And I just need you to listen to what I'm going to say. Can you do that?" Right? And he did. And she gave him choices. She said, "Do you want to stay here, or would you like to move somewhere else?" He said, "No, I want to stay here." And she said, "Okay." She said, "Do you need some water? Would you like some juice?" He said, "No, I don't want any of that." She said, "Okay." She said, "Would you like to play a game? We could play Uno, or we could play checkers." And he said, "Checkers." And I'm shocked. I mean, this kid just came and like threw stuff all over the classroom and was completely out. I just have never seen someone in so much pain. It was really painful to watch because I didn't know how to help him. But he wanted to play checkers. And so for the next 15 minutes, they played checkers, and he calmed down and he was able to regulate himself. And then he was eventually removed from the home after all the paperwork and red tape was taken care of. But he and his brother were both removed from their family, which at the time was exactly what needed to happen. But watching her be so calm, and I'm thinking, how in the world is checkers going to help this situation? And sure enough, it did. So that's a way to approach folks. First, you have to be regulated, right? Because any bit of heightened energy on your part is going to just heighten the situation, right? So very calmly, "Hello, my name is, I'm here to help. I'm going to need you to listen. Can you do that?" Right? And then this is kind of how you translate it for a kid in crisis, right? Hey, so you walk over and warmly greet them. Maybe they know you, maybe they don't. And then you can mirror the current situation, right? "I see you're having a really tough time," right? "I see you're really frustrated," or "I see you're really angry," or "I see that you're really sad," right? I'm here to help. Right? And then kind of providing those clear, concise instructions on how they need to help you help them, right? I need you to help work, or I need you to work with me so that we can help get you in a better place, right? And something that we don't remember very often, and I'm sure many of you in here are parents, because I know that's what this whole series is about. But oftentimes when our kids are dysregulated, right, we get frustrated, we get angry, because whether we're embarrassed or we expect them to not be having these reactions, right, we get frustrated. But what we have to remember is that when kids are having a meltdown and they're really, really out of control, they are terrified, right? So that's why I put right here, like, remember, this is the scary zone, right? Kids feel out of control. They feel overwhelmed by their own emotions, and they don't feel safe, and they don't feel comfortable, and they don't know what to do. When your kid is having a complete meltdown in a total freak out session, just go over and ask them if they need a hug. And now you may feel like you just want to like walk away and not deal with the situation because you're so overly frustrated with them, but walk over and ask if they need a hug. And most 9 times out of 10, they will say, yes, I do. And you can give them a hug, and you can understand that they are in this scary zone, right? And they need you there to help co-regulate that, right? And that can be with your breathing. And it can be, like I said here, you have to co-regulate. So with your breathing, your calm, compassionate, empathetic self, right? And kind of the whole approach is, I see that you're in distress. I see that you're struggling, and I'm here to help you, right? But again, your emotional regulation is the key here to any of these kind of crisis situations, right? So to kind of wrap up, and then I want to leave time for questions here at the end, of course, as I kind of start out here saying that I truly believe that we could look at this as the most important issue to address because it affects so many things. It affects pretty much every area of our lives. So I found this when I was teaching a psychology course a few years ago, and it was done just in July of 2020. And it was a plan to make Pennsylvania a trauma-informed, healing-centered state. Of course, this made me very happy. So I will read what the letter from the Office of Advocacy, and this was by this gentleman, Dan Yearman. And he says, "It has been a long journey for me to be writing this letter. There were times when I was a child living in the midst of domestic violence that I wondered if I'd live to adulthood. There were times as an adult with an ACE score of 8, remember 8 out of 10, and untreated post-traumatic stress disorder that I wondered if I'd amount to anything. Now I sit in the governor's office with the charge of reforming the way our state engages with vulnerable populations, not just to avoid re-traumatizing people, but to work towards preventing trauma in the first place. If my life has taught me anything, it is that healing is both possible and life-changing." So I would hope that our government here in Oregon, and possibly even our country, could look at preventing trauma, right? Which starts with seminars like this, right? Where we're learning about trauma and the prevalence of it. And we're learning how to not re-traumatize people, right? And working towards preventing it in the first place. And then when it does occur, knowing that healing is possible, right? So thank you. These are a few resources that I shared already. If you yourself have experienced this and have ACEs that might be re-triggered, you don't need to watch this. This is for folks who are just new to this and who probably have either very low ACEs scores or do not have abuse in their background at all. So this is Through Our Eyes, Children, Violence, and Trauma. It's an introduction. It's a video. It's about 13 minutes. It's very powerful, but I do give the trigger warning because it is very intense. And then this is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's the test if you want to take it, and then also resources for parents. There's also the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is here. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration have wonderful resources for child traumatic stress. And then there's Trauma Informed Oregon, which has tons of different resources on it as well. Youth Move National also has trauma informed resources, and it's available in Spanish and English. I think some of these other ones have Spanish options as well. This is right here in Washington County. This is the Family Peace Center Project. And they have a 24-hour-a-day help hotline, which is this number. And then this is their resources here. And then there's also the Latino Network Community Resources Oregon, which also has trauma-informed resources and counseling and various areas for folks to find information. And then this is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. This is in English and Spanish. It's available 24 hours a day, and you can either dial or text 988. So instead of 911, it's 988. They had a hotline, a national suicide hotline, but realized that it was too long for people to remember. So 911 is the crisis, which you can always call, but the suicide and crisis lifeline is 988. So questions do folks have as we're kind of nearing the end of our session here this evening?
Carissa, one thing that I thought was interesting, you related that COVID was not really considered a traumatic event in some circles, which I find absolutely fascinating, having watched my children go through it.
So I agree, and I continue to participate in trauma-informed trainings, right, and work with the folks that are, very intimate with the research. And so I felt the same way, and I have actually been saying to my classes, to my family and friends, like, we are all dealing with collective trauma, just based on my understanding, right? And you're right. I mean, seeing my own kids go through it, but I think their point was that there's like very specific experiences it's experience different for different folks, right? So depending on what your kids experience. So for example, we lost my mother-in-law in December 2020 to COVID. So she was a very healthy woman. She went into the hospital and she never came out. My son at the time was 8 years old, and he experienced that loss as traumatic, which is interesting because my grandmother, who was 100 years old, had just died a few months before that. And he said, but Gigi, was my great grandmother, he said, but Gigi was old. And he said, and Nana was healthy, right? And then he saw all the things like, wait, we didn't have to have this happen. This could have been prevented if family hadn't gotten together for a party. Like, it was there were so many factors. And so for about 2 years, he had a really hard time going to sleep on his own. He definitely had sleep difficulties and nightmares. And when I would talk to him about it, he'd say, I'm just worried about you guys. I'm worried that something's going to happen to you guys. I'm worried that, right? And I'm thinking, so he experienced that in that way, right? So I totally hear what you're saying, Larry. And I think it really depends on the individual and what they went through, right? Because, I have heard that some kids loved online school, right? And some people were able to, really thrive in this setting, but that wasn't the case for most folks in my experience. So I'm there with you.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask Carissa? You can unmute if you'd like to. If not,
I have one.
There we go.
I guess my question is about the kids. Do we talk to them about and identify it as being trauma? And at what age are they really ready to be able to themselves say, wow, this was.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So is it Toby?
Yes.
Okay, so are you referring to like a specific thing like abuse or divorce or neglect, or are you talking about the COVID conversation we were just having?
Nothing really specific, but I have a child who's non-binary, and they've already had situations that have been traumatic, and so I don't know at what age and I assume they will in the future. Fingers crossed, no, but it could happen. And so I'm just wondering, at what point are they able to say, this is what this is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in that context, I would say that I think giving kids language for things is really empowering, right? And teaching them about their emotions and their responses. And I think it's very appropriate to talk to them about, this was a traumatic experience for you, whether it was bullying or, abuse or neglect or whatever it was. This experience that you had was traumatic, and it impacts how you relate to the world. And it gives you, you might have some additional needs because of it, right? And we can work towards creating a safe environment for you. And like I said, there's lots of resources, but there's lots of different counseling techniques and things that can really be beneficial for kids as they're healing from trauma. So again, that's the beautiful thing, is that they can definitely heal from it. And I'm sorry that your child has to grow up in a world where folks don't quite understand all the unique ways that children are born into this world. So thank you for asking that question.
So there was substance abuse in the household at the time, and the grandmother actually, who had guardianship, told the 5-year-old that there was drug abuse going on. I believe 5 is too young to provide that kind of answer in depth to her, and she's wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And thank you for your, your honesty and your courage and your own healing, because that's really the most important part, right? Is that you're healing. And so your child too will be able to heal from that. And maybe in the word, you can talk about it necessarily by saying, or maybe the language would be, mommy was going through some really difficult times. It was probably very difficult. And there might've been some feelings that you had that were sad for you. And we can talk about those. You can talk to mommy about any of that, right? You can share that with me, and just again setting up that safety and setting up the communication for kids to talk is really super important, to have them be able to communicate and to talk, and then to also teach them about their emotions. We didn't have enough time to get into that, right? But that's my big thing too, is that when folks understand their emotions, they understand what they need, and that is really to kids. So maybe there's a lot of wonderful books out there about teaching about emotions, and that might help them to identify the language to then start talking and having more healing conversations with you as you guys move forward and as they grow.
I think we're about ready to wrap up here, and you've got some resources which will be sent out, and plus you can contact you can contact Carissa as well as us.